is today helping us with, besides that preparation setup, she's helping us with videotaping the presentation. It's a Friday afternoon as usual, and I wish to thank you for coming. Speaker, who is this guy? Our own colleague, Dr. Smith, and we hear a lot about, interactive, extended, embodied, what's the last one?
I don't remember, there's too many.
Yeah, the
Embodied, enacted, extended, embedded, ecological, evolved, expanded. It's just all these E's.
Yeah, like the extended mind
Excellent.
thing. Excellent, okay. So we vaguely know that somehow this, the idea, or the ideas, a cluster of ideas, has been inspired by researchers of the West, especially those working in cognitive science that looked into Buddhist epistemology, so to speak. And we have an expert on this subject, very nearly the best expert, am I right?
No.
You say yes. On the topic, so please help me thank Dr. Smith to do this presentation for us today. So thank you very much.
So I'm going to start on a personal note. I was informed the day before yesterday that the person who first introduced me to Buddhist philosophy and phenomenology died very suddenly. His name is Vincent Shen. He taught at the University of Toronto for many years. And I hadn't talked to him in a long time, so I was really disturbed when I heard it. I was quite upset. And I was thinking about giving this talk, and I wanted to dedicate it to his memory because he had just such a huge influence over me when I was much younger than I am now. And there were two things that I wanted to mention about his work that are relevant. He was a very gifted phenomenologist, and he coined a term in phenomenology called strangification. And this idea is the process of rendering that which is familiar and intimate, foreign and different and strange in order to learn about it anew in a new way. And so part of what I'm going to try and do today is to engage in a kind of phenomenological reflection of strangification on 4E cognition. And the reason I'm going to do that has to do with something he told me once during one of our meetings when I was a senior undergraduate. He asked me where my family was from. And I was like, I don't know. Europe? And he was amazed because he told me that it was necessary for him and his family to know the heads of his family genealogy back something like 50 generations. He had all of that internalized. And he was like, you guys have a really weird connection to your past, or lack thereof. And I was thinking about that when I was coming up with the content for this talk, and I thought, you know what, it would be a good way to honor his memory is to engage in a kind of genealogical strangification of my own philosophical background. So I was raised up learning about cognitive science from my mentor, Evan Thompson, who first articulated the framework for 4E cognition in an important book that he wrote with his mentor, Francisco Varela, a book called The Embodied Mind, which first came out in 1991. So part of what I'm going to do today is to engage with that text pretty closely in order to trace the evolution of 4E cognition back to some inspiration that it took from interactions with Buddhist philosophy. And in the process of doing that, I'm going to try and pay some homage to the giants whose shoulders I've had the privilege to stand on. Now, in order to understand what this is all about, we need to understand the project of cognitive science, which is multiple. And so the thesis I'm going to argue for today is very particular. And that's at the middle of the first page of your handout. The thesis is something like the following. The embodied affect, the feelings that we have in our living bodies, play a very important motivating and organizational role for how the various E's of the 4E cognition paradigm function to make human experience possible. Now that will become coherent and comprehensible to you. I'm going to go through what these E's mean and how they work in a minute. But that's going to be the view I'm going to try and defend. And I'm going to defend it by doing two things. The first thing is I'm going to do a kind of genealogical reconstruction, both in terms of how 4E cognition has evolved and how it takes its initial inspiration, at least partially, from Buddhist philosophy. Then I'm also going to re-articulate a facet of Buddhist philosophy that I think has been underrepresented. Because everyone's an expert on Buddhist philosophy these days. Everyone knows what it's all about. And mostly when you think about what the core interesting insight of Buddhist philosophy is, it's this idea that we're all selfless persons, that there are no selves. I'm going to argue that this is actually kind of besides the point. I don't really think it's that interesting compared to some of the other resources that Buddhist philosophy has to offer to the project of cognitive science. And so what I'm going to try and do is articulate a quasi-rigorous view about how affect works in different ways within the framework of Buddhist philosophy, and how we can apply those insights to questions and debates that are happening in cognitive science right now. That's what I'm going to do. It's too much. I probably won't get all of it, but we'll try. We'll try. We'll see how it goes. So, 4E cognition. What is that? In order to understand what 4E cognition is, we need to understand who its enemies are. Because, of course, we don't come up with views unless we're talking about why someone else got it obviously wrong. So one way that the 4E cognition framework gets its start is by responding to two paradigms in cognitive science that it actively rejects. The first one we can call cognitivism. This is the view of cognitive science that was relevant at its inception. It has to do with an idea that if we want to understand the human mind, we need to build one. And in order to build one, we need to get really sophisticated computers. That's the nutshell view. I'm going to read a quotation on this from Varela, Thompson, and Roche. This is the bottom of the first page of your handout. They say that symbols, the basic syntactic units that are the structure of basic units of mental processing, are both physical and have semantic values. So they're physically instantiated in the system, but they have a meaning. Computations are operations on the symbols that respect or are constrained by those semantic values. In a computer, that is, syntax mirrors or is parallel to the ascribed semantics. The cognitivist claim, then, is that this parallelism shows us how intelligence and intentionality, semantics, are physically and mechanistically possible. Thus, the hypothesis is that computers provide a mechanical model of thought, or in other words, that thought consists of physical, symbolic computations. We don't need to go into too much detail about this proposal. The main point to take home from this is that what it takes to model the human mind is a very abstract process that doesn't really care too much about the material substratum that realizes the mental process. This is why, for example, if we wanted to play a game of chess, it would not matter what the pieces were made out of. As long as we understood what the relevant roles were assigned to each of the individual components, in relation to well-established parameters, in this case the board, we could play a game of chess. They could be made out of sponges. It doesn't matter. Cognitivism has a similar view about the human mind. It doesn't matter what it's made out of. It could be a brain, it could be silicon chips. As long as the components of the system are causally related in an appropriate way, we have a mental state. This view comes in for trenchant critique from another version of cognitive science that we can call loosely connectionism. And this is the view that says, well, look, the only minds we really have any acquaintance with are minds that are realized in wetware. They're biological systems. So if we want to model these things, we might want to look at the organizational dynamics of the living systems that realize the minds we know for sure exist. And so connectionists thought, well, instead of trying to model intelligence in an abstract, symbol representational kind of way, let's look at the way brains actually work. Let's build systems that create emergent global properties from the local interactions of component parts that are unintelligent. That's the connectionist paradigm. Now, 4E cognition is the view that neither of these are going to work very well. And the reason for that is at least twofold. And I'll articulate what those reasons are in a minute, but what I want to do to start is just get those E's on the table so we can understand, at least in a preliminary way, what the contrast class is here. So I've actually listed 5 E's, because people just want to keep adding E's to this list. I don't know why, but one of them at least seems interesting, so we'll go with 5. The first E, to my mind the most important E, is embodiment. The human mind is an embodied mind. It is not an abstract, disembodied mind. So if you want to understand how the human mind works, you need to put it in a body. The second is enacting. The body is not simply a passive information processing machine. It is an agency-laden, active organism that is interacting with the world. So if you want to get a human mind working, you need to put it in a body that's active in some way. The third one's probably the most interesting, and we can talk more about it in the question period if you want. It's the most interesting, but I also have the least to say about it because I'm not sure what to make of it. Extended. This is the view that the mind does not exist within the threshold of the skull or even within the threshold of the body, but that parts of the environment separate from the body can be recruited into the cognitive architecture of the mind. Look no further. Okay? This is probably the most compelling example of what an extended mind is, of what the extended mind is. If I take this away from you, I don't know how many Facebook posts I see, people like, oh my God, my phone broke. And it's just like an existential crisis. Why? You lost part of yourself. So there's a lot of actual technical details about this proposal. But at brass tacks, we can understand this proposal to be that certain parts of the surround can be recruited into the cognitive architecture of the organism when it plays a suitable causal role. Fourth, embeddedness. This is the idea that the environment in which the system finds itself is not merely a bunch of spatiotemporal particulars with sensible properties that the system reads off, but rather that the organism is embedded and integrated into a meaningful, dynamic, reciprocal relationship with its surroundings. And then the ecological dimension of this is that that surroundings is actually a robust, phylogenetically deep context. That the embeddedness that we have is the result of millions of years of evolution. And that that's also a relevant piece of the story of how it came to be that there are minds like ours in the world. So that's the picture. Now, for this talk, I'm going to focus mostly on the first two E's, primarily embodiment and a little bit about inaction. The others will come in, but in a more secondary way, because I just think those two are the most important. Now, I want to also make two preliminary comments about circumscribing the scope of my inquiry, because as you're no doubt noting, the threshold of explanation here is massive. There's just so much being claimed in just an initial articulation of the view, like, okay, what's he going to even say about this? There's too much here. So I'm going to focus. The first point is, what is 4E cognition even a theory of? Okay. It could be a theory of a number of, is it a theory of thought? Is it a theory of perception? Is it a theory of consciousness? I'm going to focus very specifically on what I will call phenomenally conscious perception. That is, perceptual states that there is something it is like for the subject to have. And that's something it is like locution. I'm lifting from Thomas Nagel's important paper, What It's Like to Be a Bat. Okay. Second, I think that we can actually reduce the ecological embedded components of this paradigm to an action, because we can't actually specify what action means outside of a context of action. So for me, I think an action is a more of an umbrella term than has been acknowledged. I'm going to go and talk about this to people who spend their entire time on this, and they're going to get really mad at me, but that's sort of my bookkeeping move, just to make things simple for myself. So, what is the big deal? Who cares? Why does this matter? The 4E cognition paradigm can help us make headway on two serious problems that come in the wake of cognitivism and connectionism. The first problem is what I call in your handout, and this is the bottom of the second page, mind-world independence. And I'm going to read from the embodied mind again. Here's a quote. We assume that the world is pre-given, that its features can be specified prior to any cognitive activity. Then to explain the relation between this cognitive activity and the pre-given world, we hypothesize the existence of mental representations inside the cognitive system. Whether these be images, symbols, or sub-symbolic patterns of activity distributed across a network does not matter for the moment. So we can see here how both the cognitivist paradigm and the connectionist paradigm come under this critique. They simply have a disagreement about the structure of the representation that's happening inside the system that maps to the world. And the presupposition that's being challenged by the 4E cognition paradigm is that it makes any sense at all to map mental processes in terms of a matching relationship between an internal representation and an external state of affairs that the representation maps. The second problem is even more powerful, and this is what I call the divorce of consciousness from intentionality. Both cognitivism and connectionism try to explain the aboutness of the mind, the way in which the mind is directed towards the world in terms of non-conscious information processes. And then they disagree about how structured those information processes are. Is the information structured propositionally through symbol manipulation? That's cognitivism. Is it sub-symbolic? Connectionism. Nevertheless, both views agree that what we're looking at is the aboutness, we get aboutness or intentionality for free just by getting the information connections right. But then there's this deep question, well, what about consciousness? What about experience? Why would there be anything it's like for these systems to have a view on the world? And so that we can put this in the form of a critique. Our consciousness is robustly intentional. And any view that reduces conscious experience to what J.C.C. Smart calls a nomological dangler, something that simply needs to be explained away, is doing serious violence to the structure of our pre-reflective lived experience. And so we need to build a better theory. And therefore the 4E cognition paradigm attempts to build such a theory. Now, that's the background. Now what I want to do is start the part of the talk that's going to be genealogical. I want to trace back the origin of 4E cognition to some inspiration that it took from a few key features of Buddhist philosophy. The first one that most people get the most excited about is the one I care the least about. And that's the idea that the tradition of mindful awareness in Buddhist philosophy can give us a really good way of understanding our own experience. And the proliferation of mindfulness-based techniques in contemporary psychology is enough to, at least from a historical perspective, demonstrate the power of this particular insight when it was first articulated in this book. And this initial foray into thinking about the relevance of mindfulness to understanding experience not only led towards a lot of what we call now contemplative neuroscience, neuroscientific studies on the neurological effects of mindfulness-based practices, but also a research methodology called neurophenomenology, which is an attempt to bring together careful descriptions of the structure of experience with experimental design. So I think that's all great. I'm not going to talk about it very much. We can talk about it in question period if you like, but I'm more interested in the philosophy. So that's why the second and third contributions, I think, are more substantial. The first is this widespread view, mostly right, that the Buddhists think that we're all selfless. And in the embodied mind, Varela, Thompson, and Rush go in very strongly for this view. And the third, closely related to the second, is the Buddhist metaphysics of dependent origination, which is the wide scope view that Buddhists have about how phenomena come to be, what there is, and how it is that things that exist in the way that they do. So I want to just talk about the interconnected tissue between these two ideas for a moment, between dependent origination and the selflessness thesis. So on the third page of your handout, I've got this kind of bifurcated chart. On the left side, I've got the basic principle of dependent origination, and on the right side, the 5 aggregates, which is the basic psychological model that Buddhists use to explain the structure of a person. So dependent origination claims the following. This is all absurdly abstract, so bear with me. When this is, that comes to be. With the arising of this, that arises. That's the first half. Second half. When this does not exist, that does not come to be. With the cessation of this, that ceases also. I've schematized this for you in 4 bullet points. We can understand the claim being made here at the level of the general principle in terms of a positive claim and a negative claim. And then each of the positive and negative claims has 2 component parts. The first part I call positive diachronic existential dependence, which is a mouthful, but it makes perfect sense if you bear with me. When X exists, Y comes to be. This is just a simple way of saying everything exists because of prior causes. Anything that exists now exists because something existed before it in time, and because of that, its cause, it is now the existence as an effect. But the second point is equally important. When X arises, Y arises. Mutual synchronic arising. So at one moment, the existence of any particular thing depends for its existence on something else which is also existing. A lot of Buddhist philosophy and the fighting that happens between Madhyamaka Buddhist philosophers and Abhidharmika Buddhist philosophers is centered very squarely on trying to make sense of how these 2 claims could both be true at the same time. Then we have the negative formulation. Okay. When X does not exist, Y does not arise. Negative diachronic existential dependence. When X ceases to be, Y also ceases to be. Mutual synchronic passing away. When we take this basic principle and we plug in some values, we generate a much more complex schema of causes and conditions. So the 5 aggregates, as I mentioned, is this basic psychological model that Buddhists use to explain the person. And canonically, they use it to explain the person as a selfless person. So you think there's a self? No, there's not. There's 5 aggregates causally related in the right way, causally connected and integrated with such precision and velocity that it gives you the introspective impression of being a self. But there is no such self. If you slow down for 5 minutes, you'll see that. That's the view. So when we take these 5 aggregates, rupa, physical form, the living sensitive body with an evolved perceptual apparatus that is differentially sensitive to relevant features of its environment. Vedana, feelings, sensations, the part of your experience that encodes the content as being either pleasant or unpleasant for you, or neutral. Sanya, recognition, the part of the mind that allows you to see things as the things they are, to have what I would call categorical perception. This is what allows the expert arborist to say to you, oak, when you're in the forest and you see a bunch of leaves. Because their categories are sophisticated enough that they penetrate the contents of their perception. Sankara, the part of the mind that reacts, that generates reactions at the level of speech, bodily behavior, and thought. And finally, vijnana, consciousness, discernment, discrimination, the part of the mind that has an epistemic knowing relation to the object that has been delivered to it by the other aggregates. When we take those 5 aggregates and we plug them into the basic principle of dependent origination, we generate these wonderful and absurd lists. And I'm not going to spend too much time on them because we spend the whole talk just on understanding what the heck's going on here. But I've left you a rather complicated set of causes and conditions on the top of the 4th page of your handout. I'm only going to focus on 2 of these links today. The most important one for understanding the motivations of the 4E cognition paradigm is the link between consciousness, vijnana, and namarupa, what I call psychophysicality. And the reason this is important is because in an extremely central dialogue called the Mahanidana Sutta in the long discourses of the Pali Canon, we see the following claim. That consciousness, vijnana, is the condition for paccaya, the arising of namarupa. Vijnana, paccaya, namarupam. And at the same time, the reverse claim is also made. Namarupam paccaya vijnanam. That means that there is a mutual conditioning influence happening here. And now in order to suss out why this idea might be relevant as an inspiration for 4E cognition, we need to understand what nama means. Rupa we already know. Rupa is the embodiment of the organism. Nama has the following components. This is in the middle of the 4th page of your handout. Feeling, vedana. Recognition, sanya. Intention, cetana. Contact, phasa. Contact is the threefold relationship of a functioning perceptual apparatus, an object that the perceptual apparatus is differentially sensitive to, and a moment of primal consciousness that arises along with the interaction of the object and the sensory apparatus. Those 3 together make contact. And attention, manasikara. Those constituents together with rupa are namarupa. And so the claim that's being made here is actually quite powerful. Namely, that without this psychophysicality, without this cognitive apparatus and living body, there is no consciousness. But so also, without a principle of awareness to animate the development of namarupa, there's no namarupa. They come together. This is an explicit inspiration to the 4E cognition theorists who are trying to understand the arising of human consciousness as a dynamic, interactive relationship between an embodied organism and its environment. And the reason this is helpful to us from a perspective of cognitive science is that it helps us solve a levels of description problem. What does that mean? It means that when we're trying to theorize about cognition, there are at least 3 related levels of description that we want to execute a theory on. The first one is what I would call a biological or evolutionary level of explanation. We want to understand how the progressive complexification of organisms over long scales of evolutionary time have resulted in the kinds of minds that populate the Earth today. We also want to understand ontogenetically, that is with respect to individual organisms, how the functioning of their nervous system and embodiment realizes concrete mental states here and now. We also want to understand how that relates to our actual experience. What it's like to be a person, a subject of experience and consciousness in a world of meaning. Not just information processing, but meaning and value. And these three things shade into each other. And the relevance of the Buddhist philosophical paradigm to this is that it gives us a way of understanding phenomenology, experience, in a way that is highly isomorphic with the dynamics that we understand the psychological and functional level of explanation and the biological level of explanation. The problem with cognitive science up till that point was that we have these interesting, dynamical, sophisticated, naturalized descriptions of how evolution works and of how neural function starts to work. What are we supposed to do with the subject? What are we supposed to do with consciousness? This kind of dynamic causal story imposes on our phenomenology a similar kind of narrative that makes the experiential level much more structurally isomorphic with the underlying levels that realize it than was possible before. And this creates ground for more progress in the scientific paradigm. Okay. Coupled with this insight is the idea that we should give up on the notion of selfhood. And I'm actually not so convinced about this, and here's the reason why. One is a historical reason. After the passing of Francisco Varela, people who are deeply embedded in this kind of analysis, I'm thinking in particular here of people like Evan Thompson, Janerdon Ganeri, this department's own graduate Matthew McKenzie actually has papers about this particular topic. It looks like dependent origination could tell us with equal coherence a story about why there is no self, or a story about why the self exists in dependent origination on the causal dynamics of a bunch of parts. And there's no internal reason why we wouldn't take one or other of those stories. The logic of dependent origination is mutually coherent with both of those narratives. And so I think Buddhist philosophy, although it centrally has organized itself around the notion of selflessness for all kinds of interesting reasons that we can talk about, what I propose to do now is actually bracket that question for a moment and think more carefully about the functional role that this concept of Vedana plays in Buddhist psychology, to apply that story, the insights that that story generates, to questions in cognitive science. So the other link from that absurd list of links that I gave you on your handout that I really want to focus on for the moment is the link that exists between feelings, Vedana, and craving, or thirst, tanha. Vedana paccaya tanha. Feelings are the condition for the arising of craving. This is actually the linchpin of all Buddhist soteriology. Because as most of us know, craving is the second noble truth, the cause of all misery. Why is that? Because when bad things happen, you wish they weren't happening. And when great things were happening, you wish they would stay forever. And that just never happens. So you're miserable. So the soteriological centrality of this claim is just right on the surface for even a preliminary understanding of Buddhist philosophy. But in addition to that soteriological claim, I want to point out that for Buddhist philosophers, at least the philosophers that I'm engaged with here, Vedana plays a central role in theory of perception and cognition and sentience. So I direct you to a passage here from the middle-length discourses, which goes like this. This is the middle of the 5th page of your handout. Eye consciousness, visual consciousness arises in dependence on the eye and forms. Okay, not a controversial claim. The meeting of these three is contact, phassa. Now, contact is the condition for feeling. So whenever a functioning sensory apparatus is appropriately related to an object that it has been evolved to discern, and a primal sentience arises in dependence on that contact, there's a feeling. There's some feeling there. What you feel, you recognize. Recognize here is the verb form of sanya. So recognition, the capacity to sort the contents of your conscious perceptions according to equivalence classes that organize your experience into things you that you've been previously aware of. All of that happens in dependence on what you feel. So your primary hedonic response towards pleasure and pain plays an immediate sorting role for what gets remembered. And I don't mean long-term memory, I mean the kind of short-term working memory that facilitates ongoing perceptual interaction with your environment. What you recognize, you think about. It is only once the perception, the contents of your conscious perception have been organized according to equivalence classes, that the contents of that perception can be fed into the higher order cognitive capacities on the basis of which you generate beliefs and explicit goals. Here's where things get miserable. What you think about, you mentally proliferate. The term here is prapancha. Prapancha is the worst. This is a very particular human form of suffering, and all of you are victim to it. This constant mental chatter, just always nattering on to yourself about something or the other, constantly. And what that does is it creates a recursive feedback loop in your cognitive economy, and that's what the next claim it makes. Namely, what you mentally proliferate is the cause of a person being beset by cognitions and reactions arising in dependence on those mental proliferations with respect to what you see and what you've heard and everything that's happening to you in real time. That's the first passage. I'm going to summarize all this in there. I'm going to do the second passage. Second passage goes like this. Friend, feeling, vedana, recognition, sanya, consciousness, vijnana, these dhammas, these elements, these constituents, these factors are conjoined, not disjoined. Why? It is not possible to separate these dhammas one from another to delineate the difference among them. Why? Because for what one feels, that one recognizes. What one recognizes, that one knows. Vijanati is the verb for vijnana. What does vijnana do? It knows its object. How does vijnana come to know its object? On the basis of the sorting mechanisms provided for by Vedana and Sanya. Therefore, these dhammas are conjoined, not disjoined. It is not possible to separate them. So, we have here 4 functional roles played by Vedana. The first is that the role what I call for primal sentience. Feelings are the most basic kind of mental event that structures our perspective on the world when our perceptual apparatus is working properly. The first moment of experience that we have in relation to contact between our functioning apparatus and the world of meaning outside of us that we're trying to engage with. It is what encodes our most basic fight or flight responses, our attempts to desperately acquire the pleasant and to assiduously avoid the painful. Ow, I don't like it. That's why none of you ever had to do a second test run on that exposed heating element. You just never did. Once you're like, okay, I got it. Done. You did that experiment, it's over now, and now your entire behavioral repertoire is subsequently conditioned from this moment till your death. Why? Because you had an unpleasant feeling and you didn't like it. Second role. The role of Vedana in conscious perception. And by perception here I mean something very technical. I mean the capacity of our sensory receptors to track relevant invariant objects that are distal to us on the basis of proximal sensory information. That's why as I move around this lectern right now, even though the sensory information that is coming into my visual system on the basis of my movement is constantly changing, because I'm changing my position, I have a visual percept of a single object. Okay? The role of Vedana in that is to provide content for our capacity for recognition. Sanya, which organizes the contents of our perception in a way that can be explicitly understood by consciousness, so that we can come to have an epistemic relationship to it. The role of Vedana in conscious perception. Third, the cognitive role of Vedana, to provide content through that organizational lens or that sorting lens of Sanya for thought and belief formation. Not to mention the ruminations. Or when you're proliferating, when you're ruminating and just spinning out in self-talk, it's not about things that don't matter to you. It's not about the neutral things. It's about the pleasant thing you really want that you can't have right now, or the awful thing that happened to you that you can't change, that you keep returning to absurdly. And finally, the soteriological role of Vedana. When we adjust our habitual understanding of Vedana, Vedana has 2 roles, right? Vedana is what allows us to be in touch with the world, but Vedana can also be objects for us. We can observe our own feelings. We can retrain our attention, and instead of having Vedana be on the side of the subject, filtering the contents of our perception for us, creating habits of aversion and craving, we can turn the feelings into proper objects of contemplation. And when we do that, we can stop reacting to them. That's the heart of Buddhist soteriology. I'm going to try and, so now what I've done is I've explained fourfold functional role of Vedana in Buddhist philosophy, at least in Pali Buddhist philosophy. And so what I'm going to do now, I'm going to do two things and then I'm going to stop talking. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to apply this to an in-house dispute in cognitive science. I didn't even start the timer. That's funny. The second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to canvass a couple of pieces of empirical evidence that I think give us independent reasons to think that this picture is exactly right. So, in-house dispute before cognition. Consider the following citation. I'm on the middle of the page, 6th page of the handout now. The road we take then depends strongly on the degree of interest we have in staying close to biological reality at the expense, perhaps, of short-term engineering application. It is, of course, always possible to define a fixed domain within which, say, a connectionist system can function, but this approach obscures the deeper issue about biological embodiment of cognition that are so central to the enacted program. Just as connectionism grew up cognitivism inspired by closer contact with the brain, the enacted program takes a further step in the same direction to encompass the temporality of cognition as lived history, whether seen through the level of the individual, ontogeny, the species, evolution, or social patterns in culture. So the in-house dispute here can be boiled down to people who think that this paradigm in cognitive science can be married with a sort of neo-functionalist model of the mind, a model of the mind that actually can still abstract away from the biological specificity of the organism that we're trying to understand, and those who don't. And the interesting thing here for me historically is that Varela, Thompson, and Roche often talk in a way that suggests they want to go both ways. They want to do both. So for example, on the bottom of page 6, they talk about the capacity of artificial singular cellular life forms, singular biological automata. We can track their behavior with the logic of Fourier cognition, but these are clearly non-conscious systems. So the way to think about this is, if the dynamics of Fourier cognition are good enough to map the behaviors of obviously non-conscious artificial life forms, then why not just use that same logic to try and get rid of conscious experience, or just analyze it away functionally? So, to deepen this dispute a little bit, we can make the following distinction, distinguish between what we would call causal coupling between a cognitive system and the external objects in its surrounding, and the normative regulation of an organism with respect to its meaningful environment. And I'm going to read another quote now. A consequence of distinguishing these two, distinguishing between mere causal coupling from the normative regulation of coupling, is that we cannot describe cognition in a way that abstracts away from the details of how cognition is materially realized. Why? Because our material embodiment is not just material. Right? That's the whole point of the embodied mind, is that the body is a living subject, not just a material object that we carry around with us. Our access to our own bodies is mediated through our consciousness of it. Or rather, even better, our consciousness with it. So this looks to be incompatible with the functionalist commitment to the possibility of any given cognitive process being multiply realized in different material substrates. So the argument here against the functionalist reading is that it cannot account for the robust normativity through which the coupling between the organism and the environment is occurring. Perceptual norms that guide behavior are manifest to a perspectival subject for whom the environment is significant. The Buddhist view is certainly anti-functionalist in this regard. Why? Because of this role that Vedana is playing, this feeling, the experience of pleasure and pain, constantly modulating every aspect of our interaction with the environment at the level of sentience, at the level of perception, at the level of cognition. So what I want to do now is apply that insight to a recharacterization of these 5 E's. Embodiment. The body is alive because it feels. And that's actually a very controversial statement, so someone can put my feet to the fire on that if you want to do a question period. It is a lived body that is sensitive to its surroundings, and it is through feeling that we have that sensitivity. The body is not an object, it is a living subject. In action. All action is motivated, tacitly or explicitly. Motivation comes from our habits of reaction to what we feel. Extension. Things get absorbed into our minds, become successfully extended minds, on the basis of providing for our needs. Our needs are encoded on the basis of what we feel. Needs articulate the motivational primes of feeling, and extending the mind is a strategy for meeting those needs. Embedded. It is only by learning to successfully navigate an affordance landscape, a landscape of meaningful objects that are available to us in perception on the basis of what they afford us. Threat, opportunity. An affordance landscape that is relevant to us, only through that does an organism become viably embedded. Success in such embedding involves a course of action that suitably meets the felt needs of the organism. And finally, ecology. The project of niche construction, the way in which species literally carve out a home for themselves collectively in their environment. That's what provides the organism with an ecological context in which they can become embedded. That process of carving out a landscape demands that an organism's capacity to effectively self-regulate couples the organism's path of action suitably with the world of meaning and significance. An ecological context is nothing but an affordance landscape that has been suitably carved on the basis of effectively motivated coupling. Okay, so what I've just done is painted you a picture. That doesn't mean the picture's true. I used a bunch of nice words. It was, look, the Buddhists thought it was true. Okay, fine. I'm going to try and provide you with some independent motivation now. Okay, and then I'm going to stop talking and we can have a conversation. Unfortunately, that the Buddhists thought it was true is not a reason to believe something. So, two pieces of empirical evidence that I think are relevant to this picture. The first is a study that was conducted by a friend and colleague of mine named Rebecca Todd, who is an outstanding neuroscientist at the University of British Columbia, and everyone should read her work. She's exceptionally gifted. What they did is they did this really powerful experiment with MEG on 3 different populations. Soldiers suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, veterans of combat who were not suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, and non-military controls. And what they did was they gave these 3 different populations an attentional blink scenario. Attentional blink is the phenomena that has to do with the rate at which, in this case, the visual system is able to process data. So if I give you a visual task, like what number is on this card, it will take your visual system about 500 milliseconds to be able to take in anything new after I've given you that initial task. And so part of what the experiment is designed to do is to give you 2 pieces of information. One, an initial piece of information, which in this case was what number is on the card, and a second piece of information which contained a word, which would be either a combat-related word or a non-combat-related word. And we would give you that second piece of information from within the attentional blink to see if the military populations, both of them, had any effectively biased attention that would allow their capture to beat the attentional blink. Everyone following? Okay. Here's what they found. Both military groups had a decreased attentional blink when the second target was a combat-related word. And more importantly, there's also greater accuracy for combat-related versus non-combat words when we were comparing it with the non-military controls. But crucially, and now I'm quoting the authors, soldiers with PTSD also rated the combat words as significantly more arousing relative to neutral words than soldiers without PTSD. So the differential, we have 2 differentials that are relevant here. One is the differential between the PTSD and the non-PTSD military populations, and one is the differential between the both military populations considered together and the non-military controls. In the first case, we have both military populations had a much more decreased attentional blink than the non-military control. But then when we compare the 2 different military populations, the ones who are suffering from PTSD were much more affected by the combat words. It was viscerally intense for them. And what I take this to show is that we are pre-tuned to the world. Literally, what is salient for us in perception is a byproduct of affective primes that motivate and organize perceptual attention so that we're already kind of looking for what we want to see. And And that's powerful to think about, because I think we all kind of have a folk psychological model of perception. We just see what's out there. You don't just see what's out there. You intelligently ignore so much stuff, it's unbelievable. So this experiment gives us a way of thinking about how our feelings, our past experiences, exercise an immediate structural role over conditioning what shows up as perceptually salient for us in conscious experience. The second experiment takes this kind of example and takes it out of the exceptional case and tries to apply it to the normal case. So this is what the authors of this study, Dickinson and Baleen, call the hedonic interface theory. This will be the last thing I say, and then I'll stop talking. So what they show, the experiment has two parts. The first part is actually just an interesting experience that one of the experimenters had. So he's on vacation in Italy, and he is thirsty, and he has, for the very first time, his taste of watermelon. He's never eaten watermelon before, so he eats watermelon for the first time, and obviously it was delicious. He's so happy. This is the most delicious thing I've ever eaten. He's so happy. And he's so happy that he goes and gets extremely intoxicated. like drunk to the point of being very ill. In quite a close proximity to his initial encounter with the watermelon. He's drunk. Gets really sick. Sleeps it off, gets up the next day. He's like, oh, I'm hungover and thirsty. I'm going to get some more watermelon. Why? Well, it's delicious. I want some more water. I need to clear out all this booze, right? This is gross. So he goes back to the stand, and he eats the watermelon, and immediately gets sick again. What the hell is going on? And they're like, what the hell is going on? So they went and they basically abused a bunch of rats. This is what all scientists do when they want to understand what's going on with their feelings. They just cruelly, invasively manipulate the brains of rats. So what they did is, instead of feeding the rats watermelon, they fed them sugar water. To the point that the rats got a taste for it. Then instead of getting them drunk on red wine, they injected them with a toxin that made them feel nauseous. Then they offered them the sugar water. The rats go after feeling nauseous to try and get the sugar water, and now all of a sudden they don't want the sugar water anymore. So here's what's going on. When you get sick, and that sickness, the onset of that illness happens within a certain post facto window of novel stimulus, part of your mind encodes that stimulus as being the cause of your sickness. If it happens close enough, if the time window is close enough, you like, that's some part of your mind goes, yeah, I don't want that. To this day, I think it's Baleen, can't eat watermelon. Can't eat it. But the trick about this experiment that makes it so interesting is that there was a part of the mind that was completely unaffected by that experience, because they engaged in a very explicit bit of rational inference, which was, that was delicious, I want more, therefore I'm going to get some. And it wasn't until they ate it again that they went, oh, this is disgusting, which then re-encoded their rational understanding of the value of this stimulus for them. Why is this relevant to what I'm talking about? Because it was the felt experience, the taste, and then the felt experience of illness that had a differential conditioning impact on both the rational psychology of his goal setting, his planning, as well as his visceral, instinctive reaction of aversion when he was subsequently reacquainted with the stimulus. Now, normally this divorce doesn't happen, right? Normally these two parts of the mind work together very well. Which is why most of your plans, most of your explicit goals are to avoid the things that you viscerally hate and to get the things that you really like. But in this scenario, we see these two things come apart. But what I think is most important here in this experiment and the one I just explained to you about the affective biased attention in the post-traumatic stress disorder scenario is it's that the feeling is what motivates every part of your mind. Mm-hmm. The visceral reaction, the rational planning, all of it. The Buddhists beat us there by like 2,000 years. And that, to me, is actually a more interesting and substantial contribution to cognitive science. And it's the one that I'm kind of spending most of my time thinking about. So I've got more to say, but I'm going to stop. There's a big objection. We can talk about it in the question period, but I think now is a good time to stop and just have a conversation. So thank you for your attention. I'll field my own questions. Go ahead.
Thank you, Sean. I wanted to ask you about the role of the unconscious in your version of cognitive psychology. I just read 2 books this last few weeks on cognitive psychology. One by John Barr, Unconscious Reasons for What We Do, and one by Fred Tallis, Hidden Minds. Both bestsellers.
Right.
And yeah, they argue that the conscious mind can be understood as a kind of voluntary controlled information processing activity, whereas the unconscious, subconscious can be understood as automated information processing activity. And then they argue for the emergence of this primacy of a new unconscious in cognitive psychology. I wanted to ask you your understanding of the role of the unconscious in your 4E cognitive psychology, and related to Buddhism. On the early Buddhist side, I'm thinking especially of the primacy of Vedana feeling in Goenka's Vipassana meditation system, where he argues that through Vedana sati, mindfulness of feelings or feeling sensations, our subconscious, unconscious vasanas, samskaras, our habit reactions, they're unconscious, so they're difficult to observe, yet all of them are embodied, physically embodied registered in sensations and feelings.
Yes.
So it's through Vedana sati, mindfulness of feelings, that we can see how our unconscious patterns are embodied in physical sensations and feelings. So yes, how do you see the role of the unconscious in both cognitive psychology and the 4E model you give very well, and its relationship to the early Buddhist concept of Vedana sati?
Okay, good, thank you. So I'm going to go in reverse order, because my answer to the second question will provide the platform for my answer to the first. So one thing Goenka says is that he has this locution he likes to use on these teaching his retreats. He says, deep in the unconscious mind, which actually isn't unconscious. And he slips it in and then he kind of continues on, but he always adds, it actually isn't unconscious. So I don't think, in my own mind, the Buddhist philosophy in general, and I would include here the Yogacara Buddhists and also the Theravada, the Pali tradition, they actually don't have much room in their model of mind for an unconscious, because even the most subliminal mental functions in the system, like alaya vijnana or bhavanga chitta, these are vijnana, chitta, they're conscious. So people fight about this, there's no one answer, but my take on this is that a better way to understand the unconscious is to think of it as a kind of subconscious, by which I mean we experience everything and then actively ignore it out of desperation, because it's too painful and absurd. If you were to, so the first noble truth of Buddhism is that there is dukkha, and the task associated with that is that dukkha must be fully comprehended. To fully comprehend the entire framework and threshold of dukkha is madness. It is too much, which is why you got to develop all of these attentional sets and magical powers in some cases to be able to actually tolerate awareness of these phenomena. So the way I try to think about the unconscious is that there's a distinction in cognitive science and philosophy of mind between what's sometimes called phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness, where phenomenal consciousness just refers to the experience. Access conscious refers to the way in which the subject has access to the contents of their experience through mechanisms of working memory and attention and introspection, and then is able to generate certain kinds of behavioral outputs rationally on the basis of integrating that content. My understanding of the subconscious or the unconscious leans very heavily on that distinction. And I like to think that we're phenomenally conscious way down, but our access consciousness is super weak. And so we often don't have the ability to reckon explicitly through attention with the contents of our phenomenally conscious experience. So I try to distance myself away from views that have a principled unconscious, where there's some line and underneath it we'll never experience that stuff. I don't go in for those types of views, mostly because I spend too much time reading Ned Block and these Buddhist philosophers. But how's that?
As you must know, Waldron has his book, The Buddhist Unconscious, where he argues alaya vijnana is the Buddhist unconscious, and then he traces it back to the Pali Buddhist canonical material.
Yep, no, I know. He's a good friend of mine.
You must argue with him.
Oh, yeah, well, I think he agrees with me, actually. I just think he called it that because he knew it was, like, I haven't talked to him about it in a while, but I bet I could get him on side. I feel like he'd agree with me. I'm going to ask him. Thank you. Eric?
Yeah,
Yeah,
just
please.
a quick question. So at the end, you said the feeling is sort of what directs our like how we directs like our actions, right? Is that sort of what you said? I can't remember the word you said, but you said.
I said a bunch of stuff.
Feeling. Well, one of the last sentences you said was. Anyway, I was wondering, like, why is it feeling and not craving that directs our
Craving is a reaction to feeling.
Okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
so craving is a very particular way in which we habitually take up with our feelings.
Yeah.
Something pleasant comes along, stay forever. Something unpleasant comes along, go away. It's like a basic primal attitude that we have.
Right.
But even if we're, fully realized yogi,
Yeah.
who's become much more detached from those primal reactions of craving to feeling, the feeling still plays this super important epistemic role in how the contents of our perception get worked up in the different levels of the system, at the level of sentience, at the level of perception, at the level of cognition. The difference between the yogi and the miserable person is not where one is influenced by feeling and one isn't. It's the influence is skillful. The influence happens under the banner of poised self-awareness rather than just blind automatic reaction. But in both cases, the view still applies. Like, I'm right in both cases.
Thank you for showing answer.
I actually had two questions. One that feeds off of what he just asked, and I guess I'll just ask that first. But
Sure.
what about cravings that people haven't felt before? So, like, being a millionaire, like, someone's never felt that and they have a craving for it, or like being a philosopher, if you've never been a philosopher before and then you have a craving for it, or anything else, even like kill someone, it goes pretty deep. And
Those are three interesting examples.
yeah, watch out. I'm just kidding.
I want to be a millionaire, I want to be a philosopher, I want to murder somebody. Craving.
But yeah, I mean, just wanting something that you haven't tangibly had before.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, two things to say there. One, I guess you might say that craving for things you've never had is just like a paradigm of craving. It's not like the exceptional case. It's the, it's the summa bonum of what craving is. We always want what we don't have. On almost every level. Like, oh, my hair's all curly. I wish I had straight hair. Like people, that happens all the time. So I'm not clear on why this is a problem. I think that we have imaginations that are able to entertain possibilities, and we always look at what we have and frame it in a negative light. And then on the basis of a perceived absence, we generate a desire for something in the future that might fill that void, and obviously doesn't. But so I just think that, that particular issue is constitutive of what it means to crave. It's not some outlier that renders the story problematic. It's actually a central part of the narrative of what craving is that we feel empty. And not the good kind of Buddhist emptiness, like that, like deep nihilistic emptiness, that something's missing. I want to fill it with something. What is it? What I don't have? Oh, I know, more money. That'll totally solve my problem. Right? My favorite is traveling. It's like, oh, the void inside. I know, I'll go to a different place. That'll solve my problem. Oh. The number of people I bet who spent all their money in their early 20s traveling and came back more miserable is just like so many, so many. So I think that that's just a constitutive part of what it is to crave.
So it could go both ways, where you felt full, like you said, pleasurable having something,
And you want it back.
and then you can also
Yeah,
feel a void of it,
Absolutely.
and then also crave it as well.
absolutely. Yeah. There's a second question, or should I move on?
Yeah, it's kind of a similar
Okay.
debate between the lines. It was, you said feeling is what makes you alive.
Yeah.
And
That was a deliberately provocative claim.
Yeah, you said like the fire and so
My defaults.
so yeah, what about people who can't feel things? Let's say
Good.
people who can't feel pain, or
pain is
they
single,
lost
yeah.
like nerve damage,
Good.
and so they don't have that sensory feedback.
Good.
And then also taking that to like plants and then rocks, like
Good.
how far does it go?
Okay, so excellent question. I'm going to be brief and cheeky, but it's a really good question. Okay, so the answer to your first question is we need to differentiate between different kinds of affects. Okay, very roughly we can say there are sensory affects. Those are the kinds of affects that tell us what things outside of us are valuable. So when I get really excited about Hannah's cupcakes, it's because I'm having a sensory affect. They're delicious. Then there's emotional affects, which are themselves quite a complicated phenomena that we can differentiate into subspecies. Then there's homeodynamic affects, which are self-regulatory things, like pain and hunger and the need to urinate. My claim would be, and this is a strong claim, if someone can't feel anything, they're dead. Like a living system that doesn't have any feeling of any kind, doesn't feel any self-regulatory process happening in the viscera of the bodily tissue at any level anywhere, that's a corpse. The second question is about how far down it goes. I have no idea. It's such a hard question. I don't know. I don't want to say that plants are conscious, but maybe they are. There's just a whole bunch of literature on plant cognition that's super robust, and I'm just like, I just don't know how to draw the line. I would tend to draw the line by leaning back on the enactive paradigm and say when homeodynamic self-regulation couples with certain primal emotional behavioral scripts, that's the threshold